Homeless veteran bullied by immigrants. Dana White sees the scene and does the unthinkable. Jake Reynolds had once been a man people looked up to. A Marine who had served multiple tours overseas, he had given everything for his country, enduring the kind of battles most civilians could never comprehend. But war had a way of staying with a man long after the battlefield was gone. The transition back to civilian life had been brutal. PTSD clawed at his mind, keeping him awake at night, filling his days with ghosts of the past. Jobs didn't last. The discipline that had once made him an exceptional soldier now made him restless and out of place, in a world that moved on without him. Before long, he lost everything. His home, his dignity, and worst of all, his sense of purpose. The streets became his new reality. Every day was a battle for survival, but not the kind he had trained for. The enemy now was hunger, the bitter cold, and the crushing weight of being invisible. People walked past him as if he didn't exist, their eyes sliding away to avoid the guilt of acknowledgement. Some offered spare change, but most just hurried by, pretending he wasn't there. He spent his days scavenging for food, rummaging through trash cans behind restaurants, hoping for leftovers that hadn't spoiled. The winter nights were the worst. He'd curl up under a thin, tattered blanket, trying to will himself to sleep as the cold gnawed at his bones. He had fought in wars, had faced death countless times, but nothing felt more painful than the slow erosion of who he once was. He had learned to ignore the occasional insults, the sneers from passers-by who saw him as nothing more than a failure. But there were some who didn't just ignore him, they took pleasure in tormenting him. A group of teenagers had made it their habit to harass him whenever they saw him. They were young, cocky, and filled with the kind of misplaced anger that often led to cruelty. Most of them were immigrants, kids who had struggled to find their place in a country that didn't always welcome them. In their eyes, Jake was weak, an easy target. The harassment started small, mocking comments, snickers as they walked past. Then it escalated. They threw food at him, not as charity, but as an insult, watching as he flinched but refused to react. Tonight, they had taken it further. One of them kicked over the few belongings he had, sending his small stash of food scattering onto the pavement. Another grabbed his cup of change and tossed the coins into the gutter. Jake clenched his jaw but didn't move. He had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. He had no strength left for another battle. The laughter of the teenagers echoed in the alley as they circled him, emboldened by his silence. One of them, a lanky kid with a sharp grin, stepped forward and shoved Jake's shoulder. He barely reacted, staring past them as if they weren't there. That seemed to frustrate them more. Another one threw a half-empty soda cup at his feet, the liquid splashing onto his worn-out boots. "Say something, old man," one of them taunted, nudging him with his foot. "Aren't you supposed to be a tough guy?" Unbeknownst to them, someone had been watching. Across the street, Dana White had just wrapped up a UFC promotional event and was heading to his car when he caught sight of the scene unfolding in the alley. He wasn't the type to stick his nose into other people's business, but something about this didn't sit right with him. He stood still for a moment, arms crossed, observing with an expression that grew harder by the second. Dana wasn't a man who believed in excuses. He had built the UFC into a global empire through sheer determination, turning nobodies into champions and proving that the fight was never over until you decided it was. He had seen plenty of tough guys in his life, and none of them acted like this, bullying a man who had already lost everything. His jaw tightened as he took a step forward. The kids hadn't noticed him yet, too caught up in their mockery to sense the shift in the air. Dana didn't say anything at first. He just walked closer, his presence alone enough to make the nearest kid take a hesitant step back. The others followed suit, their bravado wavering as they recognized who he was. Dana White wasn't just any man. He was a powerhouse, a walking storm, someone who had built an empire by surrounding himself with the toughest fighters in the world. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but edged with unmistakable authority. "You think this makes you strong?" He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze like a blade. No one answered. The ringleader, the lanky kid, tried to recover, straightening his shoulders. "Just having some fun," he said, his voice not as steady as he wanted it to be. Dana scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah? Looks more like a bunch of punks trying to feel big by kicking a man when he's already down." He glanced at Jake, who hadn't moved, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to the group. "Let me ask you something. How many of you would be standing here right now if it weren't for guys like him? You think you have it tough? Try sleeping on the ground every night. Try fighting for your life and then coming back to a country that doesn't give a damn about you." The kids shuffled uncomfortably. Some of them looked away, but Dana wasn't finished. He took another step closer, lowering his voice. "You want to prove you're strong? There's a gym not far from here. Come by tomorrow. I'll show you what real toughness looks like." There was a long pause. The teenagers glanced at one another, unsure. The invitation didn't sound like an opportunity. It sounded like a challenge, one that none of them could easily back down. Dana didn't wait for a response. He turned to Jake, his expression softer now. "You got a name?" he asked. Jake hesitated before answering. "Jake." Dana nodded. "All right, Jake, let's get you up." He extended a hand, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt something unfamiliar, someone actually giving a damn. After a moment, he took it, and Dana White pulled him to his feet. Dana White wasn't the type to stand by and watch something disgusting unfold without saying a word. He had built his entire career on confronting things head-on, whether it was a business deal, a fighter's attitude, or an unfair situation. This, a group of kids ganging up on a homeless veteran, this was something he had no patience for. He stepped forward, his presence shifting the air, his movements slow and deliberate, the way a predator moves when it knows it has complete control over a situation. The kids, who had been laughing and taunting just moments before, noticed him now. Some of them immediately recognized who he was. Their expressions flickered between excitement, confusion, and something else, something closer to hesitation. One of them, the lanky kid who had been leading the harassment, straightened his shoulders and tried to act unfazed. "Yo, that's Dana White," he whispered to one of the others. The kid next to him nodded, eyes wide, but then smirked to cover up his nerves. Dana wasn't interested in pleasantries. He didn't waste time asking stupid questions. Instead, he got right to the point. "You think you're tough?" His voice was level, but it carried the weight of a man who had dealt with some of the most dangerous fighters in the world. "You think picking on a man who fought for this country makes you strong? That doesn't make you tough. That makes you weak as hell." The words cut through the group like a blade. The bravado cracked just a little, but the lanky kid scoffed, trying to play it off. "Man, we were just messing around. It's not that serious." Dana took another step closer, staring him down. "Messing around? Humiliating a guy who's already at his lowest. That's what you call fun." He shook his head, disgusted. "You wouldn't last 2 seconds in a real fight. You wouldn't dare pull this crap if you were standing across from someone who could actually fight back." That struck a nerve. The kid squared his shoulders, glancing at his friends. He didn't want to look weak in front of them, not in front of a man like Dana White. "We're not scared," he shot back. Dana smirked. "Good, then prove it." The group exchanged looks, suddenly unsure where this was going. "Prove it?" one of them echoed. Dana pulled out his phone, dialing a number. "Yeah, it's Dana. You at the gym?" "Good. Open up. I'm bringing some kids over." He hung up and looked back at them. "You want to act tough? Let's see what you've got. Meet me at the UFC gym a few blocks from here. Step into a real fight. Show me your strength where it actually matters." The cockiness flickered. There was a difference between bullying a homeless man in an alley and stepping into a real fight under Dana White's watch. But they couldn't back down now. They had called themselves tough. If they walked away, they'd be proving him right. The lanky kid forced a smirk. "Fine," he said, trying to sound casual. "We'll come." Dana turned to Jake, who had been watching in silence. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something that had been missing for a long time. Interest, maybe even the smallest spark of respect. "You coming?" Dana asked him. Jake hesitated. He hadn't stepped into a gym in years. He hadn't thrown a real punch since before his life had fallen apart. But there was something in Dana's voice, something that felt less like an offer and more like a challenge. And Jake had never been one to back down from a challenge. After a moment, he nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. Dana clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Let's go." The walk to the gym was mostly silent, the kids shifting nervously, the weight of their decisions sinking in. They had wanted to prove something, and now they were about to find out exactly what they were made of. The gym was a stark contrast to the cold streets outside. The scent of sweat and leather filled the air, and the rhythmic sound of gloves hitting pads echoed through the space. This was a place of discipline, where respect was earned, not given. The group of kids stepped inside, their confidence wavering as they took in their surroundings. The bravado they had displayed in the alley began to slip as they realized they were no longer the ones in control. Dana led them toward the center of the gym, where a few fighters were already warming up. These weren't just any guys off the street. They were young, hungry prospects, fighters with real skill, real discipline. Some were a few wins away from the UFC, others were already on their way up. These were men who had dedicated their lives to the fight, and now they were about to teach a lesson the kids wouldn't forget. "All right," Dana said, crossing his arms. "You wanted to prove how tough you are. Here's your shot." He motioned toward the fighters. "Pick one. Get in the cage." The lanky kid who had led the bullying hesitated but forced a smirk. "Fine, let's do it." His friends weren't as eager, but none of them wanted to be the first to back out. The first match was over in less than a minute. One of the kids, thinking he could rely on wild swings and bravado, found himself slammed onto the mat before he even understood what happened. His opponent, a young fighter with a wrestling background, moved like a machine, calm, precise, merciless, in his control. Within moments, he had the kid in a chokehold, forcing a tap. The rest of the group watched in stunned silence. One by one, the others stepped up. One by one, they were humbled. A striker took one of them apart with pinpoint kicks and counters. Another got ragdolled in a grappling exchange, unable to breathe under the pressure of a real fighter. Some of them lasted a little longer than others, but the result was always the same. Each of them left the mat winded, defeated, and most of all embarrassed. Dana watched without sympathy. He knew this was the only way they'd learn. They had walked in cocky, thinking strength was about overpowering the weak. Now they were being shown what real strength looked like. Calm, disciplined, controlled. When the last kid tapped out, Dana turned toward Jake. The veteran had been silent the entire time, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. There was no amusement. In his expression, no satisfaction. He had seen fights before, real fights. These kids had just been given a lesson, but he knew it was up to them whether they learned from it. Dana smirked. "What do you think, Jake? Ever step into a ring before?" Jake shifted uncomfortably. "A long time ago," he admitted. "Boxed a little before I enlisted." That caught Dana's attention. "Yeah? You any good?" Jake exhaled, rubbing his knuckles out of habit. "I held my own." Dana studied him for a moment, then turned to one of the trainers. "Get him some gloves." Jake hesitated. It had been years since he had done anything like this. His body wasn't the same. His Mind wasn't the same, but when he looked at the kids, some still catching their breath, some looking at him like they were seeing him for the first time, something stirred inside him. He had been invisible for so long, a ghost walking among the living. But here, now, he had a chance to remind himself who he used to be, maybe even who he could still be. One of the trainers tossed him a pair of gloves. Jake slipped them on, feeling the familiar weight, the way the padding molded to his hands. He took a breath, then stepped into the ring. One of the fighters, a young guy with sharp footwork and quick hands, squared up with him. "Just move around," the fighter said. "Loosen up a little." Jake nodded, lifting his hands. The first few movements were stiff, but then muscle memory kicked in. His feet found their rhythm. He slipped a jab, countered with a light hook. The fighter nodded approvingly. Dana watched with interest. There was something there. The way Jake moved, the way he reacted, it wasn't just experience, it was instinct. He might have been rusty, but the foundation was still there. Jake kept it controlled, his punches sharp but measured. He wasn't here to prove anything. He was here to feel something again. And for the first time in years, he did. When the short sparring session ended, Jake lowered his gloves, breathing heavier, but feeling more alive than he had in a long time. The fighter grinned at him. "You still got it, man." Jake smiled, just a little. Dana turned to the kids. "See that?" he said. "That's a real fighter, not some bum on the street, not someone you can kick around for fun. That man fought for something bigger than himself. He lost his way, yeah, but that doesn't mean he's weak. It means life knocked him down, the difference between you and him. He knows what it means to get back up." The kids didn't have a comeback this time. They weren't sneering anymore. They weren't laughing. They were seeing Jake, really seeing him, for the first time. Not as a homeless man, not as someone beneath them, but as a warrior who had been through more than they could imagine. For the first time since that night started, the kids looked ashamed. And maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to understand. Dana White had seen too many fighters, too many warriors slip through the cracks. He wasn't about to let Jake Reynolds be another forgotten name. That night at the gym had shown him something. Jake wasn't done. He had the heart of a fighter, even if life had beaten him down. And if there was one thing Dana believed in, it was giving real fighters a second chance. After the sparring session ended and the kids left, still shaken from their humbling experience, Dana pulled Jake aside. "What's your plan?" he asked. Jake shrugged. "Survive, I guess." "That's not a plan," Dana shot back. "That's just waiting to die slow." Jake exhaled. He knew Dana was right. He'd spent so long just existing, getting through. Each day with no real direction. It wasn't how he used to live. It wasn't who he used to be. Dana crossed his arms. "You ever think about getting back in the gym, training again?" Jake hesitated. "I don't know if I got it in me anymore." Dana scoffed. "Bullshit. I saw you move in there. You still got something left, and I don't let talent go to waste." He paused, then continued. "I'm not letting you go back to those streets. You want a shot? I'll give you one. But you have to take it." Jake looked at him, trying to gauge whether this was real. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'll get you a job at the UFC Performance Institute," Dana told him. "Nothing crazy, helping around the place, staying close to the sport. You get some stability, you train, you rebuild. But you have to show up. No excuses." Jake swallowed hard. He hadn't been offered anything in years. No second chances, no opportunities. And now, standing in front of one of the most powerful men in combat sports, he was being given a shot. A way back. "All right," Jake said, nodding. "I'll take it." Dana smirked. "Good. Be there tomorrow, early." And just like that, his life changed. Over the next few weeks, Jake threw himself into the opportunity. The UFC Performance Institute became more than just a workplace. It became his sanctuary. He cleaned mats, stocked supplies, did whatever was needed, but more than that, he trained. Every morning before his shift, he hit the bags. Every evening, he stayed late, watching the fighters, absorbing everything like he used to. His body remembered the rhythm, the movements, the discipline. The transformation wasn't just physical. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. Dana watched from a distance, satisfied. He had a good eye for fighters, but more importantly, he had an eye for people who refused to quit. Jake was one of them. He had been through hell, but he wasn't staying there. One afternoon, as Jake was wrapping up his shift, he heard voices behind him. He turned to see the group of kids, the same ones who had bullied him that night in the alley. For a split second, his muscles tensed, but something was different. They weren't cocky this time. They weren't smirking. They looked uncomfortable, like they weren't sure if they even had the right to be standing there. The lanky kid, the one who had led the taunts, stepped forward first. His hands were shoved in his pockets, his gaze darting between Jake and the floor. We just wanted to say something." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" The kid swallowed hard. "We were assholes," he admitted. "We treated you like garbage. We didn't know anything about you. We didn't understand." He glanced at his friends, and they all nodded. "But we do now." Jake studied them. They weren't just saying this to make themselves feel better. He could see it in their eyes. They had learned their lesson, not through words, but through experience. They had felt what it was like to be powerless, to be humbled. And now they were here, owning up to what they had done. The kid took a breath. "I'm sorry," he said, "for real." Jake let the silence stretch between them for a moment. Then finally he nodded. "All right." The kid blinked. "All right?" "Yeah." Jake exhaled. "You screwed up. You know that now. That's enough." The tension in the group eased. They hadn't expected forgiveness, but they got something better, acknowledgement. Dana, who had been watching from the side, finally stepped in. He looked at the kids and shook his head. "You got lucky," he told them. "You had someone willing to show you what real strength is. Life will test you again. Next time, you get to decide. Are you going to be the punks who kick a man when he's down, or are you going to be the guys who help him up?" The group was quiet. They understood. Dana turned to Jake. "And you?" Jake smirked. "I think I'm done staying down." Dana grinned. Damn right. Weeks turned into months, and Jake was no longer the man he had been that night in this alley. He wasn't just some homeless vet scraping by. He was a fighter, a mentor, a man with purpose. He trained daily, helped younger fighters, and, for the first time in a long time, he had a future. One evening, as he stood in the gym, wrapping his hands, Dana walked up beside him. "You ever think about stepping back in for real?" Jake looked at him, then down at his hands. A year ago, the idea would have been laughable. Now he wasn't so sure. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know I'm not done fighting." Dana nodded, satisfied. "That's all that matters." As Dana walked away, leaving Jake to his training, he didn't do it for cameras or applause. He didn't care if anyone saw what he had done. Because this wasn't about publicity. This was just what real fighters did.